Hello, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of the Emerald Planet and Emerald Planet TV. We come to you on a week-to-week basis from Washington, D.C. in the United States as we look around the globe in 144 different nations, looking for those 1,000 best practices, the technology, services, and products that are making a difference as we move through the 21st century. And as we have a planet of 9 billion people by 2038 and possibly 12 to 13 billion by the end of this century, how are we going to be able to take care of all these people on planet Earth? And that's what Emerald Planet's all about. We come to you looking at the solutions, the best practices from around the globe as we create the Emerald Planet. Hello, welcome to the Emerald Planet. We're making a difference as we move through the 21st century. And seeing the long-term impacts of climate change. We're glad to have you. Thank you for being with us.
As a world-class model for what's coming in the future, the Department of Energy and Environment of Washington, D.C. is the first platinum LEED city in the world. And that really does mean something. And we're going to be talking about Climate Ready DC as a model for many other localities. But one of the things we can say about the Honorable Tommy Wells, who is the director of DC Department of Energy and Environment, he is constantly going around the world, interacting with his peers, being involved with the United Nations as far as the climate change and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of how do we blend energy, environment, and how do we actually get climate ready. So Tommy, looking at Climate Ready DC, how do we actually get to these points that we're looking at right here? And why in this lower right-hand corner, we've got the windmills and the solar and other things going and the Capitol looming in the background. How does all this mesh together for the future of DC, but the future of the United States and possibly the world?
So we know that under the Paris Agreement, we need to cut our greenhouse gases that we cause anywhere in the country. But one of the things we also know is that cities have been the problem with industrialization, but cities are also the solution. You can get so many more efficiencies through being smart about how your city works. So Clean Energy DC is a energy plan to cut the greenhouse gases from our buildings. Our buildings are responsible for 74% of all the greenhouse gases we cause. So the way to manage it, it's like a pie. You shrink the pie, and that is by using less energy, retrofitting the built environment. And then you increase the renewable slice of the pie. And so it gets even bigger the more you shrink it. So that's kind of the visual of how that works. But that's how we're going to address it. But in Clean Energy DC, which really came out of Climate Ready DC, that told us what's going to happen to our city: hotter, wetter, and a lot wilder with these storms.
Now, looking at the wild part of this, this is something that you're addressing. We talked about this some moments ago. Well, let's go back and revisit. How is this wild nature of climate where we have these very intense high energy storms? Now some of them are being even called cloud bombs. How is that affecting the built environment we have here, but also the 300 or more legacy cities all over the United States?
Well, in particular, we know we're a city on two rivers, and most cities in America, older cities, are built on waterways. So we're all familiar with flooding, whether you're on the Mississippi River or you're on a coastal city. We're familiar with flooding. The difficulty that we're not familiar with are these microbursts, to where tremendous amounts of rain and wind gets dropped in one small area, to where it can be raining and flooding near my home, but just 2 miles away, the sun is shining. And these microbursts are intense. We had our first derecho, I guess about 10 years ago. We had never heard of a derecho. And then this storm comes and it blows down trees, takes out the power lines, takes weeks in some neighborhoods to get the power back up, and the amount of water that was dumped was incredible.
Mhm.
So we have to create resiliency from inside the city when we're used to protecting the city from the waterways on the edges of our cities.
Mhm. Now, looking at this uh, chart here, as far as the impacts are going on, we see sea level rise. We're looking at extreme weather and all that, but people say sea level rise, Washington, D.C., 125 miles away from the ocean. How does it get sea level rise? And how is this happening to cities across the country, some of them thousands of miles away from the ocean?
Well, for us, that's a great question because people sometimes forget that we may be pretty far from the ocean, but our rivers are tidal. So when
Mhm.
high tide means our rivers are higher, low tide, the opposite. We have one river, the Anacostia River, to where the river flows both ways. Eventually, it flows out, but because of the rising tides, it flows both ways. And what that means for us, we've had over about 50 years an increase of our sea level rise by 11 inches, almost a
Mhm.
foot, and it's still coming up. So a lot of the homes and built environment, roads and such, were really predicated on a lower level of water for our rivers, which are impacted by the oceans. So
Mhm.
that's what it means for the city, for our city, that we're impacted by the ocean levels.
Yeah, and you were talking about this earlier as far as we have to really retrofit the cities for human beings. We see this image here of extreme heat. They're now saying that there are many cities, not yet in the United States, but in places in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, that actually, and even Australia, are becoming uninhabitable by people in certain months of the year, that really people are not going to be able to live there as we move forward. So, what are you seeing? We see the participation and extreme weather images here. How are we seeing more of this in Washington, D.C.? And I'm camping on this slide right now because there's so much in this that you've shared with us, Tommy, that I think we really need to raise the issues.
Well, I really appreciate you kind of making that point because at the Paris Agreement, they started off saying, let's not have temperature rise on average more than 2 degrees Celsius
Mhm.
based on from the industrial area. And they wanted a unanimous signing of that agreement. And there were countries like the Marshall Islands that said, if it gets to 2 degrees Celsius, we won't have a country. And just the whole diaspora that we see
Mhm.
people leaving cities or leaving countries, moving from one area to another.
Mhm.
And because of the extreme heat, that is already caused the agreement to be at 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Mhm.
In DC, we'll have a heat emergency for a couple of days. Well, within the next, few years, that will be a week, and then it'll
Mhm.
be 2 weeks. And what it means for us is that infrastructure starts to change.
Mhm.
Your metro rails start to warp. The
Mhm.
intensity of the storms because of the heat and the evaporation of the water becomes more explosive. And we've already seen that out in the ocean. Cooling temperature, hotter waters are creating bigger and more intense and more hurricanes that are pushing up into our country, and it'll
Right.
affect DC. So the climate has changed and it's rapidly changing.
Yeah, and the storm surge is making a huge impact. Wanted to get to this. Looking at the heat waves, this is something you're saying is going to be increasing over the years, maybe even year by year, as we go forward towards 2050. How do we address that so that we don't really have this? Because you see these stars, and this is scary.
Well, we know that high heat can knock out your power grid. So think about what it's like to be in your car with the windows rolled up on a 100-degree day with no air conditioning. That's what a lot of these glass buildings that we built will feel like within 5 hours
Mm.
if their power goes out because the grid could not withstand the heat because of all of the air conditioning draw on it. And then people will have to evacuate the buildings. So the way we have to deal with it is that we have to cool the city. We have to have a smarter grid. We have to be able to really withstand this changed extreme climate of, again, not just the heat, but it helps create the soup, the mix, the chemical kind of reaction of the explosiveness of the storms together.
Mhm.
So we have to plant trees, put on green roofs, create more rain gardens. We've got to green the city. Everybody knows what it feels like when a hot day, you're walking down a sidewalk and pretty soon you have mature trees on both sides of you. You feel the temperature drop by about 10 degrees.
Right.
That's real. And so we, I was impressed. You noted earlier that our tree canopy is around 37%. And our goal is to get to at least to 40% by 2032. And we're well on our way to getting there. But the tree canopy is so important for absorbing water and, capturing, CO2, but then also cooling our city.
Yeah, and just like with the urban forest that we actually planted, we're 6 feet from where I'm sitting right now, is that it's just amazing. In about the next 5 to 7 years, the entire backyard will start being under canopy, and that's going to make a huge difference. Heavy rain events. This is something that we're seeing more and more of, and they're becoming more extreme and more violent.
Yeah, I think that everything has to be resilient now. You're not protected by large amounts of rain. And we are going to have to figure out how to manage more and more of it on the surface, that we have to be able to capture it either on roofs or in bioswales along any paved areas. And again, trees expirate the moisture at a far higher rate than just evaporation.
Right.
So managing the flooding, we're also going to have to look at, we have areas where Fort McNair is down at Buzzard Point, and that is the entry level for flooding out that part of Southwest City. There used to be a canal on the street that goes right up next to Fort McNair. It's a low piece of land. So one thing that we have to do is also think about not just stopping water from coming in the city. How do you channel it to get it out? Can we drop our parks 4 feet like they did in Copenhagen to capture rainwater? Are there ways to channel water, capture water on the surface by changing the built environment to protect catastrophe?
Yeah, and this is one of the things that I did with the urban forest, and of course this is through your DOEE department. But when they came to plant the trees, I said, I want to do it like they're doing it in India. I want these a foot below the surface of the yard. And it's amazing, Tommy, on these heavy rain days, the water is literally running across the yard, not down the yard, towards where these trees are, and going in and nurturing the roots. And these trees grew over 2 feet in the very first year they were planted. And so we were supercharging them. But what you're doing is really paying off. But we need to look at even different ways of putting these things in. Severe storms, and we're about running out of time. So looking at this, Tommy, as we go forward, how do we reduce the negative impacts on our built environment, Washington, D.C., other cities, and how do we take those resources, the severe storms, the water, even the heat, and turn that into an asset, and it becomes something that's a resource, not a waste? And we got about 30 seconds.
Best example is we have a brownfield, had toxic land that needed to be remediated. We put a solar farm on it and then put a fence around, and just that solar farm will be able to keep power going to over 780 households to help them to be resilient. And in that area with the solar farm, we've put indigenous meadows for butterflies, birds. It is part of the ecosystem of the city. So thinking ourselves about renaturing the city, harvesting sunlight, harvesting air, all of those things together really will create and we can reuse the water from the rain. So we just need to get more simpatico with the environment, and we can manage this.
Yeah, and I like your term, renaturing, or maybe as it's being said, rewilding the cities. Tommy Wells of DOEE, thank you very much as we create the Emerald Planet.